The image is almost unbearable to describe. Women once draped in crisp white uniforms, symbols of healing and hope, now drift like gaunt shadows behind barbed wire. They had been the angels of German military hospitals, tending to shattered bodies on the Eastern Front and in North Africa. Yet by 1943, captured in the chaos of Tunisian collapse, they themselves stumbled weakly, ribs pressing against thin uniforms, eyes dulled by hunger. Their hands, once steady enough to suture wounds, now trembled when they lifted an empty tin cup. On the dusty grounds of Camp Swift in Texas, the sun glared down, revealing every hollow cheek. An American guard, Private First Class Joseph Manning, recorded in his notebook that the nurses looked less like trained medical staff and more like pale phantoms. He had never seen soldiers with such fragility. One woman, Sister Irmgard Kruger, collapsed during roll call and whispered, almost to herself, "So this is how angels fall." The contradiction was staggering. These nurses had been trained in the pride of the Reich, presented as pillars of strength and devotion. Propaganda posters showed them smiling beside wounded heroes, promising recovery and morale, but reality tore that image apart. In makeshift desert hospitals, supplies had dwindled to rags and bitter herbs. By the time they were marched onto Allied ships, they were already half-starved. The journey across the Atlantic had been a trial in itself, packed into holds, surviving on rations thinner than soup. Many fainted. A diary fragment later confiscated from Nurse Hildebrandt read, "I prayed not for victory, but for bread. Even a crust would have been mercy." Now, standing in the dust of Texas, their eyes scanned for food but found only silence. Their uniforms, once immaculate, hung in tatters. The image of angels was gone. What remained were women on the edge of collapse. The irony was cruel, the healers now in desperate need of healing themselves. The scene shocked the Americans. It also marked the beginning of a psychological unraveling for the prisoners. They had expected whips, starvation, humiliation. Instead, they found themselves face to face with something stranger, almost disorienting abundance waiting just beyond their reach. The stage was set for their world to be overturned by something as simple and as devastating as a glass of milk. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? And what time is it right now in your part of the world? The first morning inside the camp carried with it an unease that tightened every stomach. For days, the German nurses had braced themselves for the inevitable misery of prison food. Whispers had traveled across the Atlantic. British-run camps were known for their watery porridge. Italians often received little more than stale bread, and Soviet prisoners had been left to starve entirely. The women steeled themselves for the same fate. In the barracks, Sister Hildebrandt tried to prepare the younger nurses. "Think of thin soup, maybe some dry biscuit," she murmured, though her voice betrayed dread. Their imaginations went further. Gray bowls of gruel, slices of bread too hard to chew, the constant gnawing ache that becomes a second heartbeat in captivity. One even said aloud what many thought better not to hope at all. The Americans knew this fear. Sergeant Harold Whitman, overseeing food distribution at Camp Swift, later wrote in a letter home, "They expect us to treat them like animals." When the bell rang for breakfast, they shuffled forward like condemned souls. What awaited them was routine for Americans, but shocking for the women. They were handed tin trays with thick slices of bread, pats of butter, a ladle of oatmeal sweetened with sugar, and even fruit, canned peaches glowing under the Texas sun. Some nurses stared at the plates without moving, suspecting a cruel trick. Nurse Irmgard Kruger later recalled, "We thought it was to mock us, to fatten us only for more humiliation. It took days before we dared to believe it was real." The contrast with home gnawed at their minds. By 1943, German cities were choking under rationing. Coffee had been replaced by roasted barley. Families ground acorns into flour to stretch their bread. Children often ate only potatoes 3 times a day. Even officers' families no longer dreamed of sugar or fruit. The gossip spread quickly inside the barracks. "Did you see? There was milk in the porridge?" One whispered. Another shook her head in disbelief. America must be drowning in food to waste it on us. The word waste cut deep for in Germany. Mothers had been jailed for stealing scraps from bakeries. For the nurses, each meal became an emotional ambush. Their stomachs rejoiced. but their pride recoiled. Was this not proof that the Reich's promises of superiority had been lies, that the enemy could feed them better than their own nation ever had? The dining hall was not just a place of sustenance, it was a stage where illusions cracked, one spoonful at a time. By evening, silence reigned. The clang of trays had ended, but the echo of abundance lingered in their minds. Hunger had prepared them for misery. Instead, they had been confronted with plenty, a paradox more painful than empty bowls could ever be. The shock came not from bread or butter, but from something poured into tin cups with casual ease, milk, white, steaming, fresh from nearby American farms, to the German nurses. It seemed almost impossible, a hallucination conjured by hunger. The smell alone, sweet, warm, carrying the faint echo of grass and barns, triggered a rush of childhood memories they thought buried beneath rubble and air raid sirens. One nurse, Anna Vogt, froze at the sight. In her diary, later found in her repatriation papers, she wrote, "I held the cup as if it might vanish. I had not tasted milk since 1940. Even children in Berlin had forgotten its touch. Yet here, in the land of the enemy, it flowed as if from an endless spring." The statistics only deepened the sense of disorientation. By 1944, American dairy farms produced nearly 120 billion pounds of milk annually. Cows in Wisconsin and Texas delivered more each month than Germany's bombed-out farms could manage in a year. For the nurses, this reality was poured directly into their hands, thick, white proof of abundance. Gossip rippled through the barracks. "Perhaps it is not real milk," one whispered. Another, after tasting, burst into tears. "It is sweeter than anything I remember." The youngest, barely 20, confessed that she had once told her nephew that cows in Germany no longer gave milk because they were too patriotic to eat. Now, shame burned her cheeks as she sipped what her homeland could no longer provide. The symbolism was unbearable. In Berlin, mothers stirred watery ersatz coffee for their children, or mashed boiled potatoes into thin paste as breakfast. Soldiers at the front received powdered substitutes, chalky and bitter. And yet here, across an ocean, the supposed enemy handed out real milk not once, not on a holiday, but as a routine part of breakfast. Private Manning, one of the American guards, noticed their hesitation. They stared at it like it was poison. He later noted, "Some held the cup to their lips but would not drink. It was as though the milk mocked them." Slowly, though, thirst and hunger overcame pride. They drank, and with each swallow, their eyes betrayed a flicker of something dangerous recognition. That recognition was not simply of nourishment, but of defeat. It was the realization that in this war, the battlefield was only part of the story, in the quiet act of drinking milk. They were tasting the industrial might of America, barns unbombed, railways unbroken, a land where abundance seemed inexhaustible. As the last drops clung to the bottom of their cups, silence filled the dining hall. For the first time since capture, the women's hunger was stilled, but their certainty was shattered. The glass of milk did more than ease hunger, it struck at pride. For years, Nazi propaganda had insisted that Germany stood as the pinnacle of civilization, while America was painted as decadent, chaotic, and racially inferior. Yet here, in the dust of Texas, the nurses were confronted with a bitter irony. The inferior nation had such abundance that even its prisoners drank fresh milk every morning. The contrast with home was brutal. By 1944, per capita milk consumption in Germany had collapsed to less than 1/3 of pre-war levels. Cities like Hamburg and Cologne saw black markets trading cups of diluted cream at outrageous prices. Families stretched their rations by mixing ground potatoes with barley water, joking grimly that it was farmer's latte. In Berlin, cafes served bitter roasted acorn coffee, often flavored with thin turnip syrup to mimic sweetness. Mothers whispered lullabies to distract their children from the taste of boiled potatoes served for the third time that day. Inside Camp Swift, however, American guards poured milk without ceremony. Some joked with each other about farm life back home, mentioning how a single county in Wisconsin had more cows than entire German provinces. These casual comments reached the nurses, and each word felt like a slap. Sister Irmgard Kruger, her lips tight, muttered, "We are a great Reich, yet we cannot give our children what the enemy gives us as prisoners." Even more shocking were the faces serving them. African-American truck drivers unloaded dairy shipments, while women in factory uniforms visited on Sundays to organize food drives. To the nurses, raised in a society steeped in strict hierarchies and racial ideology, the sight was disorienting. A captured lieutenant among them whispered, almost in disbelief, "Their women work like men. Their black soldiers eat like officers, and yet they feed us." The gossip turned sharp. Some prisoners grumbled that it was all a trick, that the Americans staged abundance to humiliate them. Others, quieter and more shaken, admitted that perhaps the Reich had lied. For every sip of milk reminded them that Germany's pride had been built on shortages, substitutions, and slogans. While America's strength flowed from its barns and factories, a letter smuggled out by Nurse Hilda Brandt captured the torment every morning. "I drink what I had once told my younger sister no longer existed. Tell her there is still milk in the world, just not in Germany." By the third week, no one laughed when trays were served. The ritual of milk had become a daily reminder of collapse, not only of armies, but of illusions. The milk was no longer just food, it became a mirror. Each sip forced the nurses to confront a truth that years of slogans and parades had concealed. The Reich had promised that Germany stood as a beacon of superiority, yet here they were captives, nourished by those they had been taught to despise, without a single word of propaganda. America's abundance did the talking. The psychological cracks widened in private moments. At night, when the barracks grew quiet, whispers replaced the rigid silence. Some nurses confessed that they no longer believed in the strength of Germany. One remembered her brother writing from Stalingrad about horses slaughtered for food, then wept when she compared his words to the milk she now drank each morning. Diary fragments reveal the depth of the conflict. Sister Anna Vogt scribbled, "This cup is more than milk. It is defeat, poured warm. Every swallow tells me we were deceived. Our pride was an empty stomach." Another noted the sting of humiliation when American guards joked that prisoners were gaining weight faster than the farmers back home. Numbers amplified the humiliation. By 1945, U.S. farms produced more than 500 million gallons of milk monthly. In comparison, bombed-out Germany struggled to feed its cities, with urban children averaging less than half a liter of diluted milk per week. Each statistic whispered in letters home became a weapon against illusions. Yet it was not only shame that grew, compassion crept in, quietly, almost against the prisoners' will. Some admitted that the Americans' casual generosity, not lectures, not sermons, just food, forced them to see the enemy as human. "They do not hate us as we were told," one nurse murmured. "If they did, why would they feed us this way?" The milk became a weapon of the mind, an unspoken re-education that struck harder than speeches. Each day, the enemy's strength was revealed not through force, but through breakfast. And now, dear viewers, pause and reflect with me. If you had been in their place, would you have resisted the milk, clinging to pride, or would you have drunk deeply, admitting defeat with every swallow? Share your thoughts in the comments. History is not just the past. It is the mirror in which we test ourselves. By the spring of 1945, something had shifted in the daily rhythm of camp life. The German nurses no longer trembled when trays arrived. Instead, they accepted the cups of milk with a silence that was heavier than words. Some even whispered Danke to the Americans, a gesture unthinkable only months earlier. What unsettled them most was not the food itself, but the hands that gave it. Young American soldiers, many scarcely older than the nurses, poured milk without a trace of malice. One afternoon, a corporal named James Carter, a farm boy from Iowa, slid an extra cup toward Sister Anna Vogt. She hesitated, expecting mockery, but he simply said, "My mother would want you to have it." Anna later confided to her bunkmate, "I thought of my brother. Would he have offered milk to a captive? No, he had nothing to give." Moments like these gnawed at the walls of hatred. A woman who had once cursed America under her breath now admitted, in a letter never sent, "The enemy feeds me like a child. I do not know how to hate them anymore." Yet not all shared this awakening. Some clung fiercely to ideology, warning others not to be deceived. In the dim barracks, heated arguments flared. Was the milk mercy, or was it humiliation? Was America kind or cunning? The debates split friendships, exposing fault lines within the group. Meanwhile, gossip added fuel to their turmoil. Rumors spread that German civilians back home were boiling wallpaper paste for starch to make soup, while here, prisoners drank milk daily. One nurse, upon hearing that her hometown bakery in Bremen had closed for lack of flour, pushed away her breakfast and wept, refusing to eat. For her, nourishment had become betrayal. Yet the irony was inescapable. The supposed enemy had taken on the role of caretaker. The nurses could not ignore the image milk served not as chains, but as comfort. The psychological wound was deep. It forced them to reconsider not only their nation's failure, but the very idea of who was enemy and who was human. So I ask you, dear viewers, if compassion comes from the hands of an enemy, is it still compassion, or is it a weapon sharper than any sword? Tell me in the comments. History is alive only when we wrestle with its questions. By 1946, the war had ended, and the barbed wire of Camp Swift was no longer a permanent horizon. Repatriation orders filtered through the camp, and the German nurses prepared to return home. Yet none of them could forget the ritual that had defined their captivity: the daily glass of milk. It had become more than food. It was a symbol, a wound, and a revelation. As the buses lined up to carry them to ships, Sister Irmgard Kruger clutched her notebook. In it, she had written, "I came here hollow, expecting starvation. Instead, I leave knowing my nation starved me more than my captors ever did." Her words captured the paradox of thousands of prisoners who returned to Germany carrying stories of American abundance. Stories that sometimes earned them suspicion, even anger, from neighbors who had endured bombings and hunger without ever seeing the other side of the war. At home, the contrast hit them with renewed force. Berlin in 1946 was a skeleton city, its streets lined with rubble, its people trading cigarettes for bread. Milk was a rarity, measured in drops. Children sucked on sugar beets as if they were candy. For the nurses, every sip of that American milk now replayed in memory, an unbearable reminder that their homeland had failed to provide even the basics of life. Statistics told the story starkly. While Germany's agricultural production had collapsed by nearly 50% by war's end, American farms continued to ship millions of gallons of milk monthly to both troops and civilians abroad. This was not merely a matter of numbers, it was a measure of whose system had proven resilient and whose had crumbled. The silence of departure spoke volumes. Some women bowed their heads as if in shame. Others stared ahead, determined never to speak of the humiliation. Yet all carried the same image: a steaming cup placed in their hands by an enemy who, in that moment, had been more caretaker than captor. The last sip of milk was long gone, but its echo remained. It was not just Germany's armies that had been defeated. It was the promise of strength, the illusion of superiority, and the pride of a nation that could not even feed its healers. For the nurses, the war's end was not only a return home, but a permanent recognition that their downfall had been written in hunger and revealed in the simple kindness of a glass of milk. The story of the German nurses ends not with the crash of artillery or the roar of engines, but with something quieter: the memory of milk poured into tin cups under a Texas sun. For these women, the war was no longer measured only in battles lost or comrades buried, but in the unsettling realization that their enemy had given them what their homeland could not: nourishment, dignity, and a fleeting sense of being cared for. History often celebrates victories through maps and numbers, but here the lesson is different. It lies in the fragile humanity revealed when power and weakness trade places. The Reich had promised greatness, yet delivered hunger and ruin. America, branded as crude and inferior in Nazi propaganda, revealed its strength not only in bombs and factories, but in barns that kept producing, in farms that sent milk across states, in a simple act of pouring abundance into the hands of captives. Years later, some of these women would tell their children about that glass of milk. Others would remain silent, ashamed to admit that their first true taste of defeat came not on the battlefield, but at a breakfast table. Yet silence itself carries meaning. It is the echo of recognition, the weight of truth too heavy for words. Perhaps this is why history lingers in such small details: a rivet gun's hammer echoing in a factory, a child's laughter at a full glass, or the memory of standing in line, trembling, as milk steamed in the morning light. These are the moments that remind us that wars are not only lost through strategy or firepower, but through the inability to care for life itself. The image remains bowed heads, silent cups, and the undeniable fact that kindness, even from an enemy, can defeat pride more thoroughly than any weapon.